Okay, it's time now for a panel discussion talking about the productivity gap, which I put up a slide in my presentation earlier showing we've got an issue. And we're going to welcome to the stage, please, Chris Hunt, who is the Transport Market Lead for the Central Area for GHD, Sam Fowler, who is the Head of Capital Projects for the Ministry of Education, Graham Johnson, he's the CEO of Fulton Hogan New Zealand, and Chris Bunny, who is the Deputy CEO for Building Resources and Markets for the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, or as we know and love it in the Wellington Beltway, MB, which is great. Cheers. Right. Everyone's grabbing a seat, and I'm going to grab a seat with you, I think. Actually, no, because I don't have a microphone, but that's all right, I've got two here, so that's plenty. I wanted to start off by asking each of you what you see as the major issues with productivity broadly in the construction and infrastructure sectors in New Zealand. By the way, we're very keen for questions as we go through. Pop them into Slido, they'll be moderated and we'll be able to pop them to the panel at the end. So, Chris, we'll start with you. What's wrong with our construction infrastructure sector, which means we've seen that big drop in productivity?
So I've tried to burn it on with graphs in the past, and I've learned from that lesson you cannot out-graph or out-statistic Bernard Hickey, so I won't do that. So we'll take your diagnosis earlier today as read. Productivity just hasn't been flash in construction for quite some time, and that's not just a New Zealand story, that's an international story. So globally, construction productivity has run at about 1% internationally year on year for about the past 20 years. That lags other sectors. General world economy is about 2.8% and 3.6% for manufacturing as a point of contrast. So we're not unique in construction having challenges, but I think we're actually worse than that. And I think if we were taking that 1% year on year for the last 20 years, we'd be a little bit happier than we are right now. Just to give you some stats though, so of labour productivity in New Zealand, and this is according to Stats New Zealand, they look at 34 industries across the economy. Construction's 26th least productive, so not doing too well on that one. I think the good news is though, looking at some of the sectors that are more productive through that period, they've done it. This is not an impossible ask to kind of crash through. So sectors like primary industries, information media, telecommunications, wood manufacturing, these are all kind of sectors that have kind of seized the opportunity and gone forward. And I think if we started to unpack how they've done that, there would be some things that we don't see generally in construction. So typically investment in R&D, investment in plant and technologies. Some of them benefit from less complicated, less confusing, less cumbersome regulatory systems. Skills investment. So there's quite a few ideas, but I'll hand over and let the others fill that out.
Just before you do though, how much of a factor is the boom-bust cycle, or has it been?
So the notes that I was given actually had a bit of a provocative edge to them, which I wasn't sure that I was going to...
You're talking my language now.
...make mention of. So the boom-bust cycle, it's really easy to paint a negative picture in the space, but over the last, how long have I got here? Since records began, we're currently in the longest and most sustained period of construction sector growth in both volume and value. So post-GFC, we've kind of trundled on quite nicely. The forecast that we have, so MB does a construction pipeline report, and I'm sure that'll get Slido a buzz with criticisms, but that's been reasonably accurate for since we started in about 2012-13. And we're in this lovely position where we're forecasting, and this is construction intentions, sustained growth through to 2023, and we end at 2023 because that's as far as we've pushed out. So it's kind of going up at about 3%, and then it bumps up to about 4 to 5, kind of 2020 to 2023. That's a fantastic kind of projection. It's not vertical, so we don't have that, that horrible kind of growth pains. But it's not flat and it's not declining. And, you know, it could be proven a fool in the next few weeks when the latest one comes out. But, you know, we should be embracing, you know, that prospect. I think the problem that we have on pipeline is that notwithstanding the fact that we do have solid construction intentions, it's still a bit hand to mouth. You never know when the next job's going to come along. So you've got certainty for a year, 2 years, 3 years, and then you wonder what happens in year 4. And that's probably, you know, driving a whole lot of the behaviours that we see in the sector where, you know, it just goes down the chain. So subbies kind of living and dying by that same phenomena. So, you know, there's a mountain of work in front of us collectively. I think it's how we actually seize upon that opportunity and give a little bit more stability and certainty. Avoid a whole lot of the things that Peter mentioned earlier, the complexity, and Sarah as well. You know, the challenges of procurement, the unhealthy risk transfer and so on and so forth. But I think Boombust, you know, we can talk ourselves into a hole, and I think we can equally talk ourselves out of it.
The other Chris on the panel, productivity, what's going wrong? How can we improve it? Or maybe it's not going wrong.
So maybe just starting with the boom and bust, maybe less contentiously, I think it's more about consistency in the procurement pipeline. I mean, if you look forward right now, Peter said it just before, there's visibility in the procurement pipeline, but it's not enough for suppliers to plan things in the future for. In the next 12, 24 months, there's a number of large projects, infrastructure projects. There's probably about 2,000 people in the sector that are going to come free from those projects. They don't all live in Auckland, so we can't all go and work on those projects up in Auckland. So it's about having the surety that you know that that work is actually going to be there in 2 years' time when those people are coming free. And I think there's two other things that I'd bring it back down to basics. I think we've got a capacity issue in industry, and I think we've got a capability issue in industry, and we need to deal with both of them. We're all keen to take on more work, increase revenue, and therefore increase profitability. But actually, have we got the capability and the depth and the capacity? One question I asked a couple of years ago when I was in the public sector and on a whole of government forum was, what is the capacity of our industry currently? Can we turn over 10 billion a year? Can we turn over 5 billion a year? And what do we need to do? Do we need to invest? You were suggesting earlier it could be 10 billion a year. You were suggesting it could be 20 billion a year.
Easy for me to say. Yeah.
That's right. But I mean, if we've got those numbers, then we actually know what the gap is between our current capability and capacity and what we actually need to deliver. And if you tie that into a certainty of procurement pipeline, then you can actually start planning for the future.
Graham, you're running one of the biggest of the firms, so you have a wide view of what's going right and wrong. What's your view on productivity, whether it's as bad as it has been painted, or whether and how we could fix it?
I think I would actually say that our industry and sector is characterised by boom-bust activity, and whether you're observing that at a national level or more of a sub-region level, it definitely happens. So I've got a number of anecdotal examples, I guess, of where you see entities shedding staff, the lists of tenderers that are competing for work growing as you come off the back of an activity cycle. And I've certainly seen examples in hot markets where there's been sustained growth, where people are capacity constrained, and yet, as you state, Chris, maybe hunting a bit of revenue, risk transfer seems to enter a different paradigm, and maybe performance drops away. I think in general we just haven't necessarily created conditions to foster productivity. I think we've accepted the way that things generally are. We understand key drivers, clarity of pipeline, that we do have a volatile sector, we'd like to invest for the long term. We have to trust the pipeline, that it's not just words on a page or a picture, it's actually going to transition to work. No one wants to be left with stranded investments or redundant capital. So I think we understand the issues, but we're not really creating the conditions yet to fully address that.
So how would you create those conditions?
I think
Apart from, abolishing elections or anything like that.
Was that from our chat earlier? But, yeah, we'll park that concept for a while. I think one of the key things to me, and it's been really interesting over the last few days listening to the conversations and some of the regular themes that have emerged, and even just earlier in the rail session, I didn't see your slide, sorry Bernard, but I was listening about high-speed rail, but a couple of things that really stood out to me there were not running endless business cases to 2 decimal places. Once you get some indicators, actually just show visionary leadership. And I think where I would start with is around leadership and actually trying to achieve a mindset where we have a focus on productivity. So it might not be a nationally unified picture that's all about productivity, but if we have a national vision or a sub-region vision about what we want to achieve, there's probably a home inside that to think about creating and fostering conditions for productivity. Then if we do that, we can set up the various things, research and development, skills, training, everything else, and actually hold people to account to living up to that expectation. So I'll probably start at the high level and then break down into the detail.
Sam, you're on the other side of the fence, I suppose. What are you seeing from a procurer's point of view in terms of productivity, and is it something that you think about or work for when you're working with your partners?
I think for me, it's about having the responsibility to create the conditions that support productivity. So the Ministry of Education, we spend about $1 billion a year investing in our assets. We have direct responsibility for about half of that, but actually a lot of what we're doing is very transactional. So rather than providing long-term confidence to suppliers, actually we're just putting opportunities out to the market without them really being able to say, well, that chunk of that work is going to be coming to me, and therefore I can have confidence in that and I can invest in my business. I was saying to one of the guys earlier that about 40% of the work we do is with only 6 suppliers, but that's on the basis of them responding and being successful in individual opportunities rather than as actually leaning into that and seeing that as an opportunity, as Patrick was referring to earlier in the housing sector, around providing that greater confidence, that longer term confidence, and then giving contractors, suppliers the opportunity to invest in their staff, to invest in R&D, to invest in plant, and really push that on. And I think that's where as a procurer, as a public agency, we have to lead in that responsibility to create that environment for increased productivity.
Chris, Bunny, what do you think the construction industry accord might generate, or what changes might come out of it that could improve this landscape a bit? Because it seems, as Peter said, there's a lack of trust, or there was a lack of trust, and it's hard to invest for the long term in all the plant and training and scale when you don't quite trust each other.
So I'll confess I was a bit of a cynic towards the construction accord. I haven't made a huge secret of that, and it kind of gets reported around town, so you might have heard it already. And that was because over the years I've had hundreds of conversations with construction sector people, and it's very hard to have the same conversation twice, and sometimes you have a conversation with the same person and get a diametrically different view. So I was a little bit skeptical that in a sector that's kind of 300-odd thousand people, getting a group that could speak for it and kind of get buy-in from it just seemed to me to be a pretty big challenge. And we kind of sat alongside for the production of the accord at the start, and then we kind of came more into the tent in the second phase. But I think what it's done is it's a conversation that I haven't seen between government and industry previously. So we've had the productivity partnership in years gone by, and that kind of petered out. It went great guns for a while. Industry and government were kind of co-funding, co-sponsoring it, and then my take is private sector kind of fell by the wayside. It became a sole government operation, and at that point you say, well, this is no longer a partnership, and it got wound up. This one just feels different, I think, for all kinds of reasons, environmental, you know, the fact that I think last year we hit pretty close to bottom. You know, there's a bunch of firms that were looking pretty precarious. It was really starting to hurt your subbies, your communities, and so on and so forth. I think we stopped talking at each other saying the problem is you guys, and those guys pointing back and saying the problem's you guys. It was actually, there's a bunch of problems and neither of us own any of them individually. This is a collective thing in terms of taking it forward. What's been really kind of inspiring through it is it's been pretty free and frank conversations and people actually, you know, airing some of the challenges and some of the solutions, and already we've started to see quite different behaviours from the public side, but also from the private side in terms of how they're approaching such things.
So when you say different behaviours, can you give us some examples?
So I can point to an increasing list of public sector agencies, but also private sector firms walking past the lowest price tender, doing the maths, working out that something's not right here, and when something's not right, somebody normally loses, and just saying, like, this isn't right. So, you know, it's kind of, it's a bit of an extension on kind of the direction of travel anyway. You know, MB kind of rules of sourcing, the government rules of sourcing, they've always advocated for whole of life pricing, not lowest cost, you know, taking into these wider considerations. What we hear back consistently is great words, but no one really follows them. Well, that's changed a bit. The rules of sourcing that become mandatory from 1 October actually have a whole lot of tweaks to them. So there's adjustments to get broader outcomes in there. There's a skills element in construction, and there's kind of health and safety requirements for some health and safety fraught industries. There's low emission stuff. There's making sure your supply chain is actually treated lawfully. So, you know, we've had examples a couple of years ago where subbies of subbies of subbies were getting absolutely rorted. You know, sub-minimum wage and stuff going on. So government's saying, actually, you want to work with us, well, this is kind of the ticket to enter. But what we've also done this time around is we've got a reporting monitoring function built in. So we're starting to not just kind of put the rules out and hope that it all goes well. We've put them out, and now we will be talking to the SAMs and people of the world just to understand what's really going on out there. And there's probably a plea to the sector, you know, help us help you. If you're seeing things that aren't quite right, if you see the rules and go, great rules, but, you know, those turkeys aren't following them, then, you know, we need to know, because otherwise it's going to be a pretty tough gig.
Chris Hunt, from your point of view, whole of life, and is it real, or is it another one of these virtue signalling things that goes on? You know, do people really believe it?
So I guess I've been on both sides of the fence, private sector and public sector. I guess my comment, and, you know, in response to Chris, there may be examples where procuring bodies are going beyond lowest price, but they're few and far between. I think procuring bodies are still struggling to understand and quantify value beyond lowest cost. And there's a number of examples, and I think the procurement survey results that were up earlier show the feeling within industry. There are some great examples. New Plymouth went with the second lowest tender for a road maintenance contract, and that cost them an extra 8 million. Now, they had to explain why they were paying an extra 8 million for that, but they did go for a whole of life value proposition on that tender. But I think there's still a huge way to actually go and to get people to genuinely understand what the whole of life value is and what the value proposition is in any tender.
So what's stopping, you know, people from doing whole of life? Because if you're thinking about a decision which on assets that last, you know, 20, 50, 100 years or whatever it is, and you're representing the interests of the taxpayer or whoever's buying the asset for the long term, then it would seem natural to do it. But of course, when people are having to make decisions based on, you know, did I meet my target for this quarter or for this year, the time horizon for the decisions telescopes in and screws the scrum of that whole thing. I mean, how well do you think the procurers are changing their neural networks and their decision making to actually go for long term rather than short term?
I definitely think it's happening. I think at CE level, I think at GM level, I think the intent is there, but quite often when it gets down to officer level, you've still got people making decision that struggle to do the real value. It's easy, take a road for instance, it's easy to do a whole of life cost on that, but does anybody ever do the economics of how often you're going to have to repair that road, the disruption that will have to the travelling public, what that does to the economy? And I would argue that no, we don't go there. So what we end up doing is we end up looking for something that is a kind of balance between capital investment now and whole of life cost, rather than genuinely going, well, we are going to look whole of life cost, and this is the best option for the next 50 years.
And not to mention, you know, the wider costs or benefits that accrue from an asset that aren't measured at all, and the beneficiaries don't pay, or the losers aren't compensated. Sam, you're on the procurement side, whole of life. You know, do you care about it, or are you thinking, I'll be out of here in 3 years and you'll never see me for dust?
I think, again, picking up on what was said there around intent and actually then what flows out on the ground, I think there's an issue around, I'll be honest, around capability within actually assessing what good looks like. But I'd say that probably on that survey, I wouldn't be surprised at all if Ministry of Education was one that said, they go for lowest cost. Now, probably 99% of our projects will be driven by a combination of quality and price, but I suppose it's how effective are we in terms of actually assessing what quality looks like and really differentiating on a meaningful basis between suppliers in order to really make the most of quality submissions or quality assessments to offset differences in price. So we might go into it with absolutely the best intentions around having a much higher weighting for quality, which we do in almost all our tenders, but does that actually track then through into a change in selection of a supplier as a result of, as I say, our ability to really differentiate or even ask the right questions of suppliers as to what meaningful differences in quality are?
Graham, I'm going to throw a tough question at you. The elephant in the room, it seems to me, is NZTA and projects that are being delivered or that are being decided on or stopped or whatever it is. Broadly, what do you think the contribution of NZTA is to, you know, improving the sector's pipeline and performance and that sort of thing?
I should probably throw this one to Chris. He was the inside man, but
don't worry, I'll come to him next.
Look, I think it's actually important to come back to the reality, which is the New Zealand Transport Agency is a delivery vehicle, among other things, for procuring transport infrastructure. And they're actually tasked with giving effect to the government's policy, which has substantially changed since the last election. That has created a huge amount of effort for them and repositioning appropriately and being able to advance things. So I think they're actually a wonderful group of people, highly skilled and competent. I'd see them as one of the lead agencies, and I think that was confirmed, although there's a general perception that a lot of the issue lies with them. They actually are very sophisticated in their procurement. They're open with industry. They produce probably among one of the best asset management plans or pipelines that's accessible by industry to understand. There's just been a heck of a lot of change in the background that they're grappling with, significant change to funding categories, and they're trying to give effect to that as best they can.
Chris Hunt, the inside story.
So they are clearly one of the sector leaders. There's no question about that. My comment would be that, you know, if NZTA sneezes, the rest of us catch a cold. We personally at GHD have seen our revenue from NZTA drop dramatically over the past 12 months. They used to be our number one client. They're now number two. Auckland Transport are now up at number one. So there is, you know, as Graham says, there was a change in government 18 months ago. The agency are now trying to adapt what they had developed to deliver to a new program of work. And we've probably all got really comfortable with the fact that for 9 years, we knew exactly where we were going. And now there's a bit of a change.
Yes. Can you give us a sense of the Infrastructure Commission and whether it will do what people want it to do, and what your initial thoughts were on the announcement at this conference and what we've heard so far from ministers and various people. So Chris first, and then I'd love to jump to Graham.
Yeah, so I'd probably say it's a good start, but it's only a start. Let's be real about it. One of the bits of feedback, and I think the construction accord, Peter put a slide up there saying we had to be bold. And actually, I think that's one of the challenges that we've got as industry. I think we're pretty conservative as an infrastructure industry. And I think we do need to be bold. I think the Infrastructure Commission needs to be really bold. There were millennials yesterday talking about the rate of change. Doesn't exist in the infrastructure industry, really. You know, and that's the challenge.
Why is that? Because we all look at the stuff and know, well, that's going to have to happen if we're going to do this. So why doesn't it change? What drives that conservatism?
Well, I think it goes back to a number of different things. I think it's that certainty of what your future workload is, and even looking beyond, you know, 5 years. You know, Graham's got the challenge of looking much further than 5 years with his organisation. So what investments do you put in there to actually, you know, improve the productivity over a long period of time? What do you do to improve the capability of your organisation and the capacity?
Graham, is the pipeline and the Commission going to be enough?
I think the Commission has a wonderful opportunity to start creating significant conditional change that we're seeking to unlock productivity, if you look at it through that context. So there's a vision piece. Everyone in this room and the country is going to have to feed into that, really. What do we want New Zealand to look like in the future? They can then actually capture that, create the national strategy over that 30-year horizon I think they're talking about. And then we get the cascading plans through to fully funded plans at sort of 5 or 10 years out. Will create confidence in industry. If the Commission can give effect to that, then we're on the right track for sorting ourselves out. And I think we'll be unlocking all sorts of value for money and better, broader outcomes for New Zealand society as a result of that. So I'm very enthusiastic about the Commission. I've been telling all of the appointees that I've bumped into that I'm drumming up support for quick, fast gains to be made, and they keep telling me not to do that. So I guess I'll keep going. But,
so what would you say to them that they should do? Let's say I give you a promotion. You're now the Prime Minister, and you've got control of the balance sheet. And amazingly in New Zealand, because we don't have an upper house and we don't have a federal system, and I'll make you the leader of the party, the largest party in Parliament, so you can basically, you're running cabinet, you can drive stuff through Parliament, you're there for 3 years, and you're incredibly popular. You know, you've done some really wonderful things. What would you say to Alan Bollard and the likes, and Treasury and the public about what you'd do? On the spot.
Yeah, interesting question. I think we're in a lot of trouble for starters. But look, I think I heard yesterday that we're not going to depoliticise infrastructure. Part of the democratic process is actually shaping up our long-term thinking for our country. So that we should accept that. That's a good thing. But what we need to do is get an appropriate time frame so we don't have decisions flip-flopping around or being half done on the fly as part of election policy that then you don't actually have a plan. Not that I'm suggesting that's the case now, but I think what I'd be encouraging the Infrastructure Commission to do, if I was the leader, would be to hold government to account, make big, bold decisions that are for the long term, not play into the politics, and actually form strong, valuable opinions, as I heard Professor McNaughton say before, that are about our grandchildren and their grandchildren, creating valuable outcomes for them in the longer term.
Chris Bunny, I'm giving you a really big promotion. You know, you're now able to do it. What do you reckon we need to solve some of these big issues, housing affordability and climate change and the likes? Let's say, you know, we're giving you a free pass. We won't tell your boss what you're just about to say, so go for your life.
Yeah, I trust everyone in here will
That's all right.
honour that. So I think there's so many things we could do, and I think the last thing we want to do is set, 1,000 hairs running or whatever the saying is. I think there is room for deliberateness. So again, coming back to the Accord, I think that gives us a great opportunity to come up with a plan that's quite realistic, phased, and actually focused on the things that make a difference. Just to kind of unwind what I said earlier, whole of life costings are whole of life pricing. It's a great thing. But I think it's of second order importance to kind of risk transfer. There's nothing wrong with buying lowest price if everyone knows what you're actually buying, and you're not trying to get more for what you're paying for. So I think where we get into trouble is when we confuse the things, where we try and get a Rolls Royce when we're prepared to pay for a Corolla. So I think, it's just focusing on the things that matter. I think it's not so much pipeline as we've already hit on today. It's actually certainty. Let people know what's going to come next in 24 months and so on and so forth. And, something that hasn't come through the conversation yet is that there's a ton of stuff already underway. So just because people help me with my notes, I feel obliged to use them. 2017, McKinsey identified the 7 things that would make the biggest difference to productivity. And you could pick on McKinsey or any number of other organisations. They broadly boil down to the same things. One is reshape regulation and raise transparency. So we've heard over the last couple of days, the aspirations around Resource Management Act. Building Act's currently going through its reform at the moment as well. And, there's aspects of that could be a game changer. We've got big problems that are actually bogging down projects in the building consenting space. We have a very clunky, ill-fitted risk allocation kind of framework that sits in there. It hasn't really embraced the ability to do innovation. So off-site manufacture, if I spoke to some BCAs around the room, they would, tell you about their trials and tribulations about actually having to put a consent on something that could be being put together, several thousand kilometres away. So, we've got to sort out the fact that through time, construction's been less of a process and a lot more like a product. You can buy, stuff that is more a product than someone actually hammering nails in at a point in time, but there's very few controls or safeguards around product supply. Another one that McKinsey had was the contractual framework. So again, around the conversations that I've had the last couple of days, everyone can cite the contract that has 50 pages worth of special conditions. The work that Treasury put together on that was, really illuminating. So, we've got to think about that a little bit differently. No disrespect to the lawyers, but because they serve a very useful purpose, but we've got to do better than that. The design and engineering processes, we can be a little bit smarter on how we do things. The procurement and supply chain, which we've spoken about, on-site execution. The construction sites today don't look vastly different than the construction sites 40 years ago. It's the same kind of thing. I'm sure we can improve that one. We heard yesterday from Rupert Hodgson, and he was impressing on us to embrace digital technology and some of the things there, the BIM, the Building Information Management. These things can be game changers, but we've got to opt to have a crack. And the final one that McKinsey makes mention to is reskilling the workforce. So every year through construction, 16,000 people drift in and drift out. And it's typically the ones at the lower end of the skills space. and they go and become a hospitality worker or a fruit picker or something, and then they'll drift back in, and it's not actually doing great things for productivity, and it's probably not doing great things for their life and livelihood. Actually giving them something that they can be part of and run a full career through. And just to finish up on McKinsey, they reckon if we hit these things well, this is a 50 to 60% productivity boost on projects. So they don't seem impossible. There's a ton of stuff already underway on those things. So rather than throw the kitchen sink at stuff, let's just knuckle down on the things that are going to make the biggest difference and nail them.
Sam, just throwing to you as one of the bigger procurers, we heard from Housing New Zealand today about the work that they're doing with offsite manufacturing, and Sam's also talking. Chris is also talking about it. What's happening with the ministry there with offsite manufacturing and trying to get scale in and get away from this, man and his dog in a double cab ute doing everything?
I think, again, looking at that kind of confidence and consistency, if we can provide those longer-term pipeline arrangements, then actually we can be looking at how suppliers to us can be creating consistent outcomes and looking at ways that they can do those better. Again, if I give a contractor a 10-year pipeline of work, well, they'll be looking at better ways to deliver that 10-year pipeline of work for me rather than just doing it the same way. We've looked at, and we have some in place already, some prefabricated off-site arrangements. Again, we have challenges around scale, around consenting, and around other things around it. But again, if we can create a stronger pipeline, more confidence, more certainty, then I think these things will naturally come up because people can invest in that supply chain and those arrangements to better deliver for us and actually have mutual benefit.
Graham, it's sort of a dumb question for you about the structure of construction in New Zealand. There seems to be an awful lot of subcontracting going on. And from a distance, it appears to me this is one of the reasons why there's such a problem with productivity, in that there isn't a career structure or a big integrated operation that can start to get consistency and long periods. It seems to me that there's an awful lot of subcontractors around, which is designed to reduce some of the risk of being stuck with people in a bust. What do you reckon about this structural problem, or maybe it's not a problem?
I think functioning healthy market, there's a lot of large companies that started off as small companies. There's probably a few large companies that are back being small companies now, to be honest, but I think you actually need to foster competition and innovation. I see a lot of innovation actually in smaller, medium enterprises. They are, there's probably a proximity thing. They're at a scale where they can really see the issues that they're dealing with close at hand. They're personally invested in resolving those issues, and they then take on things like innovation. They can move more swiftly than potentially a large corporate can. So I don't know that structurally there's too much of an issue there. I think we need to have a balance. In terms of the market, what I would say though is self-performance and actually having a desire in your organisation to hire people, train and develop them, and provide them a long-term career in the creation, operation and maintenance of infrastructure is important. If we don't have enough large organisations doing that, or we don't have a system that allows that to happen, then we're going to have some issues, I think, because your thinking becomes possibly shorter term and less efficient, more segregated in that regard.
Chris Hunt, on industry structure and subcontractors, and whether we've gone too far down the path of trying to offload the risk and push it down to someone else?
I don't think so totally. I've observed probably over the past few years subcontractors building long-lasting relationships with main contractors. So they always know who's going to come and do their earthworks for them on the next job that they're going to do, who's going to come and do the fit out on a new school. So I think there's some relationships that are building there, and I think it probably is all down to that trust between the main contractor and the subcontractor. I think it's healthy. I agree with Graham. I mean, we need a market where the top 5 or 6 contractors in the country are getting challenged by people that used to be small contractors. They're now medium size, and now they can bid for some of the bigger projects as well.
Chris Bunny, there is an argument that New Zealand needs a lot fewer construction companies. We need to get rid of all these mums and dads and double care utes, and we need big scale, companies to do it. What do you? And that one way to do that would be for government, led by government, to give big long pipeline, lots of work, saying 10, 20 years. Build your balance sheet up, you've got plenty of resilience, you can be guaranteed lots of work, 4 or 5, companies doing this, and we can clean out all these bitsy guys with lots of efficient product. What do you reckon?
Yeah, I used to cite off fun facts, which I will completely misconstrue now, but it was something like, of the 300-odd thousand people active in the sector, 95% of all firms employ fewer than 5 people. 99% of, or something like 1% of firms employ greater than 50. So it is a hugely fragmented, small-scale operation, right across the space.
Why is that? What makes us so different? I'm assuming this isn't like this in everywhere else.
So I think it is any number of reasons, but I think it is a low kind of barrier to enter and exit type concept. And, I think a lot of, I'm being very generalistic and probably quite offensive right now, but a lot of builders, they decide they want to be a builder, and they buy the ute and they get the dog and they get a mate and off they go. And actually to take the step change to get, a couple of dozen people working for him, that's a totally different business. You see the same thing actually in primary care. Doctors, GPs are notoriously bad business people because that's not what they went into business for. And I think that is a real challenge for, those things that we mentioned earlier in terms of getting, if we bring it back to productivity, about all the things that you need to do to become better at producing for the same amount of input. Investment in skills, plant, all that things. You're not really going to do it if it's you and Dave and your dog. So, part of the, one of the other kind of broader outcomes through the new rules of sourcing is, and we have to be a little bit delicate here because we are subject to international trade agreements and so forth, but the government's very keen to support local business. And I was cheating a little bit because I didn't want to get ambushed by Bernard, so I was checking out Slido on the way through to see what might be coming. But there was a question somewhere about diversity. And that's supporting New Zealand business. It's really pushing into the Māori Pacific space in terms of trying to encourage them into supplying to government. So, I think if you were to build the system, you probably wouldn't design the sector participation in the way that industries have formed or firms have formed in the shape that they have. Through time, perhaps, we might see some more consolidation. I personally would see that as probably being advantageous, but it is what it is right now.
Consolidation, from the ministry's point of view. Sam, what do you reckon?
Certainly it's our intent, as I say, to look more closely at our supply chain and make sure we do have more consistency and making sure that the big suppliers who are working for us have more certainty over their pipeline. But I think we're also very mindful of maintaining plurality in the people who work for us and supporting that kind of local economies and those smaller suppliers. The ministry, probably similar to Housing New Zealand, and it has a large geographical spread. Actually we've got schools all over, from right at the top of the north right to the bottom of the south, and we need a supply chain who can respond to that. And your big corporates, those big 5 or 6 who work with us, aren't going to be in a position where they can respond to from a few $100s to hundreds of millions of dollars worth of work. So we need to maintain an effective sector and an effective economy that can respond to our needs.
So just going to Slido there, one question that stands out here is, should we move to one national building consenting authority? And is this something that the government's looking at? Chris, that's sort of in your basket. Is that a good idea or something that is being looked at?
It's something that has featured in some of the Accord discussions. So we've got, I think, 69 building consent authorities at the moment, and talk about perhaps having a government one, Housing New Zealand perhaps taking on that function. And one of the common conversations, well, I have many common conversations in this. One, from the BCA point of view, is how damn hard it is to get consenting officers, and the fact that you just get one and then a neighbouring jurisdiction manages to lure them across the boundary. Another one that we hear quite regularly is the inconsistency between BCAs. So something that's fine in one part of the country, you drive 10 kilometres and it's not fine there. So that's not helpful. It would probably be okay if you're a builder operating within that geographic footprint, but if you're a firm who's doing stuff across territorial boundaries, then that's not good.
Particularly if you're doing, factory-style manufacturing and compiling things together long ways apart.
And we did actually see post-Christchurch, Canterbury lent on a lot of other consenting authorities to pump through the volumes that they had. So it's been done before. I think that's a conversation still being had at the moment. I can see arguments as to why it might be a good thing.
Just a final question before we wrap up. I just wanted to go around each of you and ask you what you think would be one thing that either the industry or government or someone does which actually improves productivity and improves the sector's outcomes in just one or two things. I'll throw quickly to Graham.
I'd empower the newly formed commission to make good on the 30-year commitment vision for New Zealand strategy, make sure that we cascade fully funded infrastructure plans and we stick to them so that we can invest accordingly.
So a 30-year big plan. Yep.
30 will do.
Yep.
50 would be
Good.
better.
50 would be better. What's interesting is it's actually really, the government currently doesn't issue 30-year bonds, which would be one great idea. By the way, Austria issued 100-year bonds for 1.2% about 3 weeks ago. Chris Hunt, your starter for 10, what's your silver bullet, sorry?
So not taking Graham's, I actually think we need to be really careful that we don't just keep thinking long term. I think we've got to think medium term and short term as well. If we don't focus on the short term and the medium term right now, industry's going to get worse, not better. So it'll be great that we've got a 30-year plan, but industry's collapsed in the next few years. So we've got to be doing things now. And the challenge I'd give everybody that's been at this conference, and one of the bits of feedback that I've had over the past couple of days, a lot of the conversations that we've had over the past 2 days are the same conversations that we had 12 months ago. So what are we actually going to do from today to actually make a change tomorrow? And that's the challenge for everybody. And it's not just public sector, that's private sector as well.
So what change will you be making?
Say that again?
What change will you be making?
So we'll carry on trying to work with clients and building those relationships. And I think one of the big things may be, and it came out of the procurement survey, suppliers are actually often afraid to tell clients when they think they've got it wrong. So, I mean, we're working on a tender right now, and we're pretty sure that the client's got it wrong, but we're not going to tell them that because it closes on Monday. And we need to change that, and we need to change that as a private sector to have those open, honest conversations moving forward.
Sam, an idea?
Just before an idea, just picking up on that last comment, we've had a couple of opportunities that have been out there, and then kind of close to the end date being said, well, actually, we're not going to go for this because of X, Y, and Z. And it's like, if you'd have told me that on day one, X, Y, and Z weren't important to me. And actually, that responsibility then comes back to me, because if I'd have engaged with you before putting that opportunity out there to understand X, Y, and Z, I'd have put it out and packaged it in a different way. So us understanding each other's needs, and again, being open enough to raise a hand and say, actually, this isn't going to work for us, or actually, Sam, this isn't going to work for you. But the main thing in terms of improving in this space is that confidence of opportunity and consistency of opportunity. And I think those things will bring about the biggest change in the ability of the industry on both sides of the table to invest and improve productivity.
Chris, your final comment?
I would, first base would be around that risk concept. Let's get those let's actually have grown up conversations between procurers and suppliers. let's hopefully start to see a little bit more profitability in the sector, and let's have an expectation that with that profitability we can have a bit of investment, and it, you know, I think this can become pretty virtuous pretty quickly if we get some of those basics sorted.
Profits, that's a good idea, yes. Excellent. Hey, thank you very much to the panel. Please join with me in thanking Chris Hunt, Sam Fowler, Graham Johnson, and Chris Bunny as well. Please give them a round of applause. Okay, and before we head off next door, there's a Becker poll which asks, how confident are you that the combination of the Construction Industry Accord and the New Zealand Infrastructure Commission initiatives will help improve construction sector procurement and productivity in New Zealand? So the question is up there, and we'd love to see the answer to that question. So do you think the stuff talked about today with the Industry Accord and the Infrastructure Commission will improve things? Or will we come back in a year's time going, So we've got some answers there. Right, it's now 3 o'clock, and we have the final plenary session next door. Now, it's still going, and if you could quietly zip next door and jump into that if you'd like. There are sweet treats on the table, I'm told, so that's great. And we hope you enjoyed this session. Thank you very much.